Cathy is a storyteller, and if you don't know who she is, you ought to know who she is. She's a Grammy-winning record producer, songist, bully, benevolent bully of people like me. She's a mentor and takes care of a heck of a lot of people in various ways. She's a wonderful storyteller. She's going to tell you a story. Please welcome Cathy Fink!
Standing next to Andy's microphone, I already feel diminished. So I'm going to tell you a story about how a tomboy from Hope, Arkansas, and the world's largest watermelon made country music history. Ruby Blevins was born in 1908 in Beaudry, Arkansas, which was right next door to Hope, Arkansas. She had 10 older brothers. She was the youngest of 11 children, so obviously she became a tomboy. She could run as fast, she could climb a tree as high, she could do her chores as quickly as all of her brothers, and they loved their little sister to pieces. And they lived on a little farm, and it was kind of frugal, but very, very comfortable, very happy. Saturday night was the big night in the Blevins family, because on Saturday night, they'd pack into the living room, and they would turn on their little tabletop radio, and they'd go like this. And you'd hear, and then you'd finally hear the music of the WLS Barn Dance. Now, WLS stood for World's Largest Store. It was owned by Sears and Roebuck. And Sears and Roebuck, the WLS Barn Dance, owned the airwaves in those days. And they had the best of country music. They had Gene Autry. They had the Girls of the Golden West, they had Hank and Hiram, they had those warbling wonders from Wisconsin, the Cackle Sisters, who together in harmony would go absolutely amazing group. And it was such great music. There was dancing, there was singing, there was square dancing, there was lively yodeling and storytelling, you name it. And there was also the most fabulous announcer in the world, Mr. Hal O'Halloran. And when Hal O'Halloran introduced an act or something that was coming up, it made you realize that the Chicago Barn Dance, the WLS Barn Dance, was going on right in your living room. The Saturday night WLS Barn Dance was not to be missed, and if you did not have a radio, you found someone who had a radio, and you got to their house. Now, Patsy loved music, and the family had a big stack of Jimmie Rodgers' 78 records. She would play those records over and over and over and over again. She sang along with Jimmie Rodgers, and she learned how to yodel from the singing brakeman. Divided into 6, her first yodel sounded like yodel-ay, yodel-ay, yodel-ay. Little did she know that that was going to become her secret weapon. Well, in 1929, she moved out to California to go to the University of the West, and she studied violin. Simultaneously, she got herself a job on the radio as Ruby Blevins, the yodeling cowgirl from San Antone. And she was well-loved, immediately well-received, drew the attention of famous cowboy singer Patsy Montana. He called her up, he said, you know what? I'm starting a girl group to back me up. I'd love for you to sing in that girl group. And she was delighted with the offer. He said, there's just one problem. He said, we've already got a girl named Ruthie. And if we have a girl named Ruby, people are going to get confused about who's Ruthie and who's Ruby. Let's get together and brainstorm. Ruby walked into that room as Ruby Blevins, and she walked out with Monty Montana's last name and the name of Patsy Montana. That name stuck. It kind of looked just like this petite cowgirl. She sang with the Montana Cowgirls for quite a while, and when that faded, she went back to Hope, Arkansas, but not for long. Now, Hope, Arkansas hadn't produced a president yet, so it only had one claim to fame. And that was the world's largest watermelon contest. This was a real contest that was started by the local druggist who also sold seeds. And every year, everybody who had a farm entered some watermelon into the world's largest watermelon contest, if they had one that was worthy. Now, no one would embarrass themselves. You're wondering, like, how big is the world's largest watermelon? No one would embarrass themselves with a watermelon under 150 pounds. Waste of time. Some of these watermelons were bigger and heavier than 175 pounds. Amazing. Well, in 1932, just to put Arkansas in a little perspective, that was the year that the famous country music singer from Arkansas was born, Johnny Cash. It is also the year that Arkansas became the first state to send a woman off to Congress, Hattie Caraway. Who would have thought that was Arkansas? And in 1933, the Blevins family grew the world's largest watermelon. It was 186 pounds of fruit. And it came with a special prize. They got to go to the World's Fair in Chicago and put that watermelon on display in the Arkansas exhibit. So when the time came, the 10 brothers, they rolled that watermelon over a couple of big blankets, and they all 10 of them circled around it, lifted it up onto the back of the flatbed truck that was padded with hay, carefully rolled it into the corner, boxed it in with some 2x4s. They put Patsy in the front seat, passenger side. One of the boys got in the front seat, driver's side. The rest of them hung out in the back of the pickup truck, and they were ready to take off. Friends and family had come to wave goodbye, and as they were leaving, Patsy's mom ran up to the front of the car and said, "Hey, wait! If you're going to Chicago, make sure you stop at WLS and say hi to my favorite announcer, Hal O'Halloran. You have got to tell him how much the people in Hope, Arkansas loved his show." They said they would do it. Off they went. 761 miles of driving with 8 of them in the back of the pickup truck, just kind of hanging around with that watermelon, before the age of superhighways. Quite a trip. They got to Chicago. They pulled in towards the World's Fair. Now, the Chicago World's Fair was celebrating the 100th anniversary of the city, and it was called the City of Progress Exposition. And it had tons of interesting things. The first interesting thing that they saw when they drove in was a thermometer that stood 200 feet into the air. Our hillbilly heroes drove wide-eyed into this wild world of whirligigs and wonderment with a giant watermelon in the back of the pickup truck. They made their way over to the Arkansas exhibit, and they saw that there was a special place all set up for their watermelon. So the boys began to undo the 2x4s, carefully roll that watermelon to the edge of the pickup truck, gather round, lift it, walk over, get it into that display case, and then upon careful inspection, they were able to see there were no dents, there were no gashes, there were no leaks. This was amazing. They took their first prize ribbon, they smacked it right on the front, and then the whole Blevins clan just kind of stood back to admire their work. Pretty good job. Look at that, world's largest watermelon. After a while, they thought, let's see what the rest of the world thinks. They're watching people go by, and people are walking by, they're going, mighty big watermelon. And off they go. I mean, the thing didn't sing or dance or anything. And so the Blevins family congratulated themselves, and they said, let's take in the rest of the fair. Well, there was a lot to take in. They made a left turn down one alley, and they saw an entire shopping area from Paris, France. They made a right turn down another alley. There was a Japanese town. They saw the midget city. It was a real midget city with tiny little houses for the midgets to live in, and 60 real Lilliputians who lived there during the entire World's Fair. They made petite little Patsy Montana look like a giant. And then they looked up, and they saw a huge sign that said, "Live babies in incubators. And a gigantic crowd right at a huge building. They were thinking, we don't even know what incubators are. And what are live babies doing inside them? We must go see. And there's this huge line. They waited in line for an hour and a half to get inside this giant building. And you know what it was? It was live babies inside incubators. It was 4 walls stacked 3 incubators high across all 4 walls. Wow. And these babies were well taken care of. They were watched 24 hours a day. They were fed every 2 hours, whether they needed it or not. And somehow this exhibit traveled from one fair to another fair to another fair. There was an entire Live Babies with Incubators exhibit in Coney Island for many years, but the Blevins family had never seen anything like this. And then they felt proud. This is the type of establishment where our watermelon is now on display. It was time for them to move on, and the next day they went to WLS to do exactly what they told Mom they would do, say hi to her favorite announcer. They get to WLS, and there's a great big sign on the front door. It says, "Auditions today, girl singer wanted." Patsy looked at her brothers and she said, "I think I want to try that. That would be fun." Well, they go inside, they find Hal O'Halloran. He is as nice in person as he was over the radio. He was way cool. He was so happy to see these people who'd come from so far away and listen to him every Saturday night. And then Patsy snuck off to the side there. She was warming up her secret weapon for the audition. There were a lot of people auditioning that day. A lot of girl singers wanted to be on the WLS radio, but Patsy was kind of unflappable. She'd spent her life competing with 10 brothers, and she had this winning smile, and then she had her secret weapon, and she got the job. The boys headed on back to Arkansas, ready to tell their mom that next week she might hear Patsy on the radio. They paired Patsy up with the coolest old-time swinging string band there ever was, a group called the Prairie Ramblers. They played jazzy licks on the fiddle and the mandolin. They were tons of fun. And in those days, the radio stations would actually assign the acts exactly what songs they wanted to have sung or what tunes they wanted to have played. So they gave Patsy and the Prairie Ramblers their assignment, set them up in a rehearsal room, and they rehearsed for a week. And they got along famously. They had so much fun together. Meantime, in Hope, Arkansas, word was spreading around that Patsy Montana was going to be on the radio. And when Saturday night came around, everyone packed into the Blevins family living room. There were friends, there were neighbors, there were friends of friends, there were relatives of relatives, there were people passing through town who didn't know anything other than something big was going on in there and invited themselves. There was barely a square inch of space available on that living room floor. They all stared at the radio waiting for the clock to reach 8. And when it reached 8, they turned it on. Dialed it in, and they heard Hal O'Halloran just in time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a brand new voice for you tonight. You're going to really love our new singing cowgirl. She's backed up by our own Prairie Ramblers. Please give a big welcome to Miss Patsy Montana." Well, Patsy came out wearing a fancy Western skirt with fringe on it, decked out Western shirt, smart Western hat, her smile a mile wide, and the Prairie Ramblers. She had her guitar on, and before you know it, the Prairie Ramblers started the song, and she started singing a very famous tune called Texas Plains. "I want to drink my java from an old tin can while the moon goes riding high. I want to hear the call of the whippoorwill. I want to hear those coyotes cry. I want to have a saddle horse by my side, riding him out on the range, just kick him in the side, make him show his Texas pride, out on the Texas plains. She was winning them over. But it only took her secret weapon to nail the deal. The crowd went wild. Patsy Montana became a figment right on the WLS Barn Dance. She and the Prairie Ramblers took the Midwest by storm. They traveled every week, Monday through Friday, playing town after town after town, day after day, 2 matinees in the morning, 3 evening concerts. Patsy learned how to sleep in a straight back chair backstage and how to cram into a car with all the musicians and all their instruments for the grand sum of $7.50 a day. Well, she loved the songs of the old cowboys. She loved the stories of the cowboys, but she got to thinking after a while, these are all boys' songs. I like these songs, but I really want to start trying to sing some songs from a girl's point of view. I wonder if I could write a song. She started writing songs. She started writing a lot of songs. And in 1935, the Prairie Ramblers and Patsy Montana drove to New York. And they went to a recording session, and she pulled out of her pocket a brand new song. It was called, I Want to Be a Cowboy Sweetheart. And it painted a picture of her working right next to her cowboy, right on the range, and equal with her cowboy. It had a great winning yodel in it, and the crowds loved it. I want to be a cowboy sweetheart. I want to learn to rope and to ride. I want to ride over the plains and the desert, out west of the Great Divide. I want to hear the coyotes howling while the sun sinks in the west. I want to be a cowboy sweetheart. That's the life I love the best. And every Patsy Montana record from then on always had one of these. Now we're going to take a second and roll back the clocks. We're talking about an era before there were cell phones, iPads, iPods, MP3 players, all this stuff that we listen to music on now. There were no instant downloads. FaceTime meant you were actually in a room talking to somebody. They were right in front of you and you were looking at each other's faces. Imagine that. And in those days, records were sold where record players were sold. And record players were sold in furniture stores. The furniture stores were getting a whole lot of requests for this singing cowgirl. Do you have that Patsy Montana record, I Want to Be a Cowboy Sweetheart? They heard that so many times until in 1935, Patsy Montana became the first woman in country music to sell 1 million records. She was a star. She was the sweetheart of the saddle. She had that $1 million smile, that fabulous yodel, and she established a precedent that influenced every female country music star from Dolly Parton to Loretta Lynn to the Dixie Chicks to Taylor Swift, and lots of those people recorded her song, and it's still being recorded and sung. The WLS Barn Dance didn't fare so well. You see, the world's largest store folks in the late 1940s didn't think that television was going to amount to very much. One of those fleeting inventions they show at places like the World's Fair that just ain't never going to happen, and so they didn't get on the bandwagon. And it didn't take long before the Chicago Barn Dance, WLS, and the radio that they knew of that time faded away, and television came in and became the new entertainment and storyteller in your living room. Now, Patsy continued performing and singing all over the place. She did just fine. She played folk festivals, country music festivals, won hundreds of awards, wrote thousands of songs. And eventually, she and her husband moved out to California, and she continued being very active until just 2 or 3 years before she passed away in 1996. So in 1978, I was making a trip through this area, and I went up to Frederick, Maryland to visit a record collector, Joe Buzzard Jr. Joe had an amazing basement full of 78 records. I've never seen anything like it. The room was probably about half the size of this room. Wall-to-wall 78s, not in any particular order except he knew exactly where every single one was. And there had to be 10,000 of them in that room. And at the same time, as he was very meticulous, and of course as a guest you were not allowed to touch any of his recordings, he was still smoking cigars and pipes down there, taking care of those 78 records. And he was, you know, you got to be just a little bit different to have extensive collections like that. I went there one time to listen to some recordings, and Joe would not let me leave at 1 o'clock in the morning until I had watched him tell his cat to turn off every light in the house. And basically, in room after room, he held his cat up like that, and the cat would go like that. And after about 25 minutes of that, I said, Joe, it's 1:30 in the morning. I really have to go now. I don't really care if all the lights aren't off. So, you know, you have to be just a little different to be fanatic about one of those kinds of collections. But I left his house with a reel-to-reel tape of all of Patsy Montana's recordings. And I listened to that reel-to-reel tape over and over and over again, just like Patsy had listened to Jimmy Rogers over and over and over again, and I sang along on the songs, and I yodeled along with Patsy Montana, and started singing her songs, and started singing more of the songs by some of the other women on the WLS Barn Dance. And in 1981, I was in California doing a radio show for two fabulous people, Roz and Howard Larman. Their show is still on the radio. It's called Folk Scene. And you play live on the show, and I thought, well, I'm going to play one of these songs by Patsy Montana. That's where the West begins. And when I was done, Roz said, now, if you are crazy about Patsy Montana's music, you should call her up. She doesn't live that far from here. Well, I was in my mid-20s, and it had actually never really occurred to me that somebody who had a big hit single in 1935 might still be kicking and yodeling. A little naive. And she gave me Patsy's phone number. So I went back to where I was staying, and I called her up. Ms. Montana, my name is Cathy Fink. I got your phone number from Roz and Howard Larman. I sing some of your songs. I love your songs. I love yodeling. And then I'm thinking, now what? And she said, well, why not over for lunch tomorrow? So the next day I took my guitar, I drove down to Long Beach, California. I went up to the second floor of the apartment building, and I knocked on the door. Door opens. There's this petite woman. Door's kind of that wide. She's looking me up and down. She says, let me hear you yodel. And I gave her yodel-lady. She said, well, come on in, we got so much to talk about. And we sat there for the rest of the afternoon telling stories about WLS Barn Dance and her talking about her journey of being a tomboy from Hope, Arkansas, taking the world's largest watermelon to the Chicago World's Fair and making a detour to country music history. And I'm just going to tell you, she will always be America's cowboy sweetheart.